Hello, what follows is an article I wrote in response to a discussion concerning the significance of artificial intelligence by Alisa Esage on YouTube. Please forgive the mispronunciations due to my having to use a digital voice to convert this to audio, but most of it should be intelligible. Our essay is titled, Reaching for a More Complete Model of Reality. You can find the text on bordercybergroup.com or ethereumarcana.org. I will begin my essay by offering a brief quote from the pramāṇa, Canto 1, Chapter 1, Verse 2, which states that the highest truth is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all. Such truth uproots the threefold miseries. After hearing a number of lectures from this remarkable young researcher, I will venture to assert that realizing the highest truth is in fact her cherished ideal. I would ask the readers and listeners to please forgive any unintentional mistakes that will inevitably present themselves in my somewhat ambitious philosophical presentation. Thank you for listening. It is truly appealing to watch a serious thinker build a model in real time. In her YouTube lecture Free Money Zone Theory and AI, Alisa Esage does not present herself as having solved artificial intelligence, economics, epistemology, or the future of human civilization. Quite the opposite. She begins from dissatisfaction. Too many questions about AI seem to her to be producing too many speculative answers, and this suggests that perhaps the problem lies upstream, not with the answers, but with the mental model from which the questions are being asked. That is an excellent philosophical instinct. When discussion repeatedly produces confusion, perhaps another opinion is not what is needed. Perhaps the conceptual map itself needs repair. Esage therefore does something intellectually ambitious, while trying to keep the resulting picture almost childishly simple. She draws reality. Then she distinguishes reality itself from the human model of reality. Whatever exists is not identical to what we presently think exists, and our knowledge of the world reaches us through sensory and cognitive intermediaries. We do not simply possess reality. We construct increasingly adequate representations of it. That distinction, reality is not the same thing as our representation of reality, is the crucial move in her lecture. From there she constructs layers of knowledge. Science occupies the hard central region, not because science is infallible, but because scientific claims are subjected to unusually rigorous procedures of evidence, criticism, theoretical demonstration, replication, and adversarial scrutiny. She explicitly rejects the childish equation science equals absolute truth. Science can be poorly designed, statistically misleading, incomplete, or simply wrong. Its distinction is methodological rigor rather than omniscience. Outside this scientific kernel, she places ordinary experiential knowledge, private knowledge, culturally distributed knowledge, and socially negotiated or consensual knowledge. Then comes the idea that gives the lecture its title, Human Knowledge Has a Frontier. Somebody occasionally works near that frontier and discovers a pattern, relationship, technique, vulnerability, theorem, process, or other piece of novelty that was not previously part of the usable collective model. Once found, however, that difficult discovery can be communicated. It can be copied, distributed, applied, packaged, commercialized, automated, and industrialized. The discovery may have been extraordinarily hard. Applying the discovery somewhere else may be much easier. Esage calls the economic territory created by that disparity the free money zone. Her example from vulnerability research is particularly good. Discovering an entirely unfamiliar class of software vulnerability can require unusual imagination and considerable technical sophistication. Once the vulnerability pattern becomes known, however, researchers can perform variant analysis, look for the same underlying mistake in another subsystem, another program, another vendor's implementation. The first discovery creates the pattern. Much of the subsequent value comes from propagating the pattern. Her insight is that enormous portions of modern economic activity work exactly this way. We often reward not the creation of genuinely new knowledge, but its distribution, translation, recombination, operationalization, and scaling. And this is where AI suddenly becomes much less mysterious. If contemporary AI is extraordinarily capable at recognizing and manipulating existing patterns, then the free money zone is almost its natural habitat. It can consume enormous quantities of already formalized human knowledge, and then translate, reorganize, implement, distribute, adapt, summarize, code, analyze, or recombine it faster than human specialists who once earned their living performing those transformations manually. This is Esage's explanation for why AI feels so threatening to so many professions. Much of what professionals believed to be expertise was actually skilled participation in the downstream economy of previously discovered patterns. But Esage does not make the usual pessimistic inference. AI eats free money zones and simultaneously creates new ones. If machine-assisted research accelerates discovery, every newly discovered pattern generates additional territory to be distributed, applied, adapted, and industrialized. AI therefore compresses old areas of economic opportunity while expanding the epistemic frontier that can produce new ones. The net result, she proposes, is not simple destruction but acceleration. Whether every part of that argument survives examination is less important, initially, than recognizing its elegance. This is a useful model. And then, almost in passing, Esage says something that reveals the boundary of the model she is constructing, the sentence on which everything turns. Near the beginning of the lecture, Esage recognizes that religion has something potentially important to say about intelligence beyond ordinary human intelligence. Then she dismisses it. Religion, she says in effect, cannot provide the framework she needs because religion is not sufficiently rigorous. Its claims would be rejected as inconsistent by too much of her audience. She therefore chooses to construct another epistemological framework. The decision is entirely understandable. It is also where the deepest philosophical problem in the lecture begins, for what has actually been rejected. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, mysticism, popular spirituality, scriptural revelation, institutional dogma, private religious experience, metaphysics, theology. Religion covers all of these and many mutually contradictory systems besides. More importantly, what does rigor mean? Esage's own account already contains the beginnings of a much more interesting answer than the simple opposition between rigorous science and non-rigorous religion. She has acknowledged that sensory experience is mediated. She has acknowledged that scientific models are provisional. She has acknowledged that consensus is not equivalent to truth. She has acknowledged that inference can fail. She has acknowledged that our representation of reality must not be confused with reality itself. Those admissions lead directly into a problem that Indian philosophical traditions spent centuries analyzing under the heading pramāṇa. And here her model encounters a philosophical apparatus almost uncannily suited to the problem she is trying to solve. Before asking what is true, ask how truth can be known. Pramāṇa means, broadly, a valid means by which knowledge is obtained. This is not primarily a theological concept, it is an epistemological one. Before arguing about what reality ultimately consists of, one asks a prior question: what could count as legitimate evidence about it? Different Indian philosophical schools develop different inventories of pramāṇas. For present purposes, three are especially useful: pratyaksha, direct perception; anumana, inference; shabda, authoritative verbal testimony. Esakutrimad Bhagavatam 11:19. 17 actually gives a fourfold formulation that also includes Aitihya, received traditional knowledge, alongside Vedic testimony, direct experience, and inference. Gaudiya philosopher Jiva Goswami goes considerably further. His Tattvasandarbha begins its substantive philosophical project by asking precisely which means of knowing can reliably establish its subject. His discussion recognizes the broader Indian debate over numerous possible pramāṇas before establishing the privileged place of revealed testimony for knowledge transcending ordinary sensory reach. That ordering matters. Jiva does not begin, "Here is what you must believe." He begins substantially. Before discussing the object, we must determine what instrument could know the object. That is methodological rigor, and it reveals something striking about Esage's model. Science operates overwhelmingly through pratyaksha and anumana. Observation supplies data. Instrumentation extends observation. Inference discovers relationships. Mathematics formalizes relationships. Experiments attempt to distinguish competing inferences. Other investigators repeat observations and attack conclusions. The resulting machinery is magnificent. But it does not follow from its success that these are the only conceivable channels by which reality could become known. That proposition would require another argument. Pratyaksha Esage already understands its limitation. On direct perception, Esage and Vedanta are unexpectedly close. Her insistence that what reaches consciousness has passed through sensory intermediaries is precisely why classical Indian epistemology refuses to equate perception with infallibility. We misidentify things, we fail to notice things, our sensory range is tiny, our attention is selective, our expectations alter interpretation. Our instruments extend the senses spectacularly, but the resulting measurements must still be interpreted by embodied cognitive agents. Jiva Goswami's Tattvasandarbha frames the difficulty in terms of characteristic defects of conditioned human cognition: error, inattentiveness, deceptive tendency, and imperfect sensory faculties. More importantly, he argues that senses adapted to material objects are not automatically adequate instruments for establishing realities whose nature would transcend their range. That is not an attack on empirical science. A thermometer is a wonderful means of determining temperature. It is simply not a means of determining justice. A radio telescope is an extraordinary instrument for detecting electromagnetic radiation. It cannot tell us whether consciousness is ontologically reducible to matter. A particle accelerator can establish properties of particles. It cannot establish by collision experiment whether existence has an ultimate purpose. The limitation of an instrument is not a criticism of that instrument. It is a demand that we not use the instrument outside its epistemic jurisdiction. Esage herself understands this principle. Science occupies the center of her reality model because it is the hardest, best-tested body of empirical knowledge we possess, not because every conceivable truth is a scientific proposition. So far, Pratyaksha does not contradict her model, it clarifies it. Anumana, the engine of the free money zone, her model is then built largely by Anumana. She observes how discoveries propagate through vulnerability research, academia, business, and technology. From these observations, she infers a general structure. Novel discovery is difficult. Pattern reuse is easier. Economic systems contain large regions devoted to pattern transfer. Artificial intelligence is exceptionally effective at manipulating such patterns. Therefore, AI will rapidly occupy those regions. That is inference. It may be a very fruitful inference. It remains an inference. And this distinction becomes particularly important when Esage moves from explaining present phenomena to predicting necessary limits on AI. She proposes that there must remain a boundary at which artificial intelligence cannot compete with human beings because AI, as a statistical prediction system, remains bounded by information available to it. Someone outside that system must continue to establish objectives and encounter the genuinely unknown. Perhaps, but her model has not yet demonstrated that conclusion. The fact that a system learns statistically from existing information does not by itself prove that it cannot derive relationships, strategies, or solutions never explicitly represented in its training examples. Nor does successful recombination settle the profound philosophical question of what constitutes genuine novelty. Her own language betrays an appropriate uncertainty here. She repeatedly calls the proposed human-only frontier a hypothesis. That intellectual restraint should be preserved. Pramāṇa allows us to say something extremely useful. Anumana may carry us beyond what we have directly observed, but its conclusion inherits the vulnerability of its premises. Inference is not the enemy, unacknowledged inference is. The missing possibility, Shabda. Now we arrive at the part of the diagram Esage has excluded. Suppose our senses do not disclose the whole of reality. Suppose our inferences are built from information supplied through those senses. Suppose reality is genuinely larger than our current model of it. So far, these are substantially Esage premises. What follows, one possibility is, we must keep pushing outward until observation and inference gradually conquer additional territory. That is her knowledge frontier. But another possibility exists. What if reality is capable of disclosing something about itself? That possibility cannot be dismissed merely by saying religion. It must be argued against, and here Shabda enters. Shabda pramāṇa in the relevant Vedantic sense does not mean that anything uttered by an authority becomes true. It does not mean rumor. It does not mean institutional popularity. It does not mean private intuition. It does not mean my religion says so. It denotes knowledge received through authoritative testimony, with the strongest Vedic claim being testimony, whose ultimate provenance is not a defective conditioned observer. This is why the epistemological question cannot be reduced to, can I prove this with my senses? If the proposed object of knowledge lies beyond the unaided jurisdiction of those senses, demanding sensory proof may itself constitute a category error. The interesting question becomes instead, is there a reliable informational channel from that reality to the knower? This is where the extraordinary rigor of the Vedic system is easiest to miss, the chain of custody. Consider Bhagavad Gita's treatment of its own transmission. The fourth chapter does not merely announce a doctrine, it describes a chain of transmission, and the following verse says explicitly that the knowledge was preserved through pramāṇa, succession, and could become lost when that succession was broken. Viewed philosophically rather than devotionally, this is an epistemic chain of custody problem. Suppose information originates at source S, it passes through A, then B, then C. Every transmitter is a potential corruption point. The question therefore becomes not merely, what does C believe, but did C preserve S? That concern is remarkably familiar to anyone working in security, scientific data integrity, historiography, digital forensics, textual criticism, or communications engineering. A message can remain intelligible while no longer remaining authentic. Vedic transmission therefore places a peculiar restriction upon the authorized transmitter. Novelty is not automatically a virtue. Indeed, doctrinal novelty may be evidence of corruption. That is almost the inverse of Esage's free money zone. At the frontier of empirical science, novelty is enormously valuable. In a high-integrity transmission system, novelty inserted into the message may be catastrophic. One field rewards discovery. The other demands fidelity. Confusing those tasks destroys both. The teacher is not permitted to become the source. This is where strict Vaishnava Siddhanta becomes much more rigorous than the popular Western category religion suggests. A teacher does not acquire authority merely by charisma. A teacher does not become doctrinally correct because followers find the teaching inspiring. A mystical experience does not automatically supersede Shastra. An interpretation cannot be justified simply because it is ingenious. The transmitter is constrained. Bhagavad Gita 4:34 describes the teacher as a tattvadashin, one who has seen or realized the truth, and simultaneously instructs the student to engage in inquiry. The Bhaktivedanta commentary explicitly rejects both uncritical following and pointless disputation. The student is expected to reach clear understanding through questioning. That hardly resembles the caricature. Faith means accepting claims without examination. There is acceptance of authority, certainly, but there is also qualification of authority. There is inquiry, there is lineage, there is consistency, there is disciplined interpretation, there is praxis, and there is a distinction between realization and speculation. Siddhanta is an anti-drift mechanism. This helps explain why Vaishnava traditions can appear almost obsessive about Siddhanta. Siddhanta means established conclusion. From outside, insistence upon established conclusions can look intellectually conservative. From inside, an epistemology based upon faithful transmission, however, the reason becomes obvious. If the knowledge originates from a source more reliable than the individual interpreter, then the interpreter's job is not to improve the source. It is to avoid corrupting it. Chaitanya Charitamrita goes so far as to warn against allowing imaginative interpretation to destroy the evidential status claimed for Vedic testimony. Yet the same tradition emphatically warns students not to become intellectually lazy about Siddhanta. A famous passage tells the student not to avoid serious discussion of philosophical conclusions merely because they are difficult or controversial. That combination deserves attention. Do not alter the conclusion arbitrarily, but also do not refuse to think deeply about the conclusion. That is not anti-intellectualism. It is constrained reasoning. The distinction is similar to mathematics. You are perfectly free, indeed required, to reason. You are not free to change an axiom midway through a proof, and then pretend you proved something under the original system. Likewise, an interpreter may reject Vaishnava premises entirely. That is intellectually legitimate. What the interpreter cannot legitimately do is alter those premises and continue calling the result strict Vaishnava Siddhanta. That is a question of informational integrity before it is a question of devotion. Guru, Sadhu and Shastra, epistemic triangulation. The system therefore does not depend upon one charismatic individual saying, "Trust me." The Gaudiya formulation repeatedly appeals to Guru, Sadhu and Shastra, teacher, prior realized authorities and revealed text. Chaitanya Charitamrita explicitly places these together as representatives through which the teaching is known. Philosophically, this functions something like triangulation. A teacher's claim must fit the textual corpus. An interpretation of the corpus must be consonant with established realized teachers. An apparent authority cannot simply contradict the received Siddhanta and repair the problem by invoking personal revelation. That does not make abuse or error impossible. No human institution can make such a claim merely by possessing procedures. It does mean that the tradition contains procedural mechanisms specifically designed to detect doctrinal drift. And that is exactly the sort of thing the word rigor ought to make us investigate before dismissing the system. Even the receiver is treated as part of the instrument. Here the difference from modern science becomes especially fascinating. Scientific methodology spends enormous effort calibrating the external instrument. Was the detector properly calibrated? Was the sample contaminated? Was the analysis blinded? Was the population selected correctly? Can someone reproduce the measurement? The Vedic epistemological project adds another uncomfortable question. What about the observer? What if greed distorts judgment? What if vanity distorts judgment? What if anger does? What if attachment to a preferred conclusion affects interpretation? What if the desire for prestige makes a person claim knowledge he does not possess? Jiva's analysis of human error explicitly includes not only perceptual inadequacy, but mistakes, inattentiveness, and the possibility of deceptive motivation. This is an astonishingly important difference. The knower is treated as part of the epistemic apparatus. Consequently, the tradition demands not only correct propositions, but discipline of the person attempting to know. Whether one accepts its metaphysical conclusions or not, that is unquestionably a form of rigor. Modern science attempts to compensate for human defect through institutions and procedures. Vedanta attempts additionally to transform the human instrument itself. Those are not mutually exclusive strategies. Indeed, one might reasonably ask whether the strongest epistemology would need both, and Shabda is not supposed to remain merely second-hand. There is another misconception concealed inside the modern word faith. Vedic knowledge does not ideally terminate in, "Someone told me this, therefore I believe it." Bhagavad Gita 9:2 describes its knowledge as pratyaksha vagamam, something understood through direct realization or experience. That introduces a fascinating epistemological loop. Shabda supplies knowledge inaccessible to unaided perception. That knowledge specifies a discipline or method. The discipline changes the condition of the knower. The transformed knower is then said to acquire realization corresponding to what had initially been received through testimony. In schematic form, Shabda right arrow hypothesis, world model right arrow discipline practice, transformed perception right arrow realization. That does not make spiritual realization equivalent to a laboratory experiment. The domains and verification conditions are different, but neither is the structure simply. Authority right arrow, belief right arrow, stop thinking. Indeed, at the conclusion of the Bhagavad Gita's instruction, K letter 1e5b letter 1e63 letter 1e47, tells Arjuna to deliberate fully upon what he has heard, and then choose what he will do. That verse alone should complicate any simplistic opposition between Vedic authority and rational examination. The text gives instruction, then it asks the recipient to think. Esage's model closes a door that her own premises leave open. We can now state the philosophical issue with unusual precision. Esage argues. 1. Reality exists independently of our representations. 2. Our sensory access to reality is mediated. 3. Human models of reality are incomplete and corrigible. 4. Observation and inference gradually enlarge those models. All four propositions are compatible with pramāṇa theory, but then an unstated fifth assumption appears. 1. All valid information about reality must ultimately enter through observation and inference. That proposition does not follow from the previous four. It has been imported. If reality contains no intelligence beyond embodied organisms, perhaps there is no other channel. But if reality contains, or originates in, an intelligence capable of communication, then another possibility appears. Reality can reveal rather than merely be discovered. Notice what has happened. We have not yet demanded belief in God. We have simply refused to exclude before inquiry begins a possible category of evidence. That is the philosophically important point. The question is no longer, do you believe in revelation? It becomes, on what epistemological grounds have you ruled out revelation as a possible information channel? If the answer is that revelation is impossible because only material processes exist, then materialism has ceased to be the conclusion of the investigation. It has become an assumption governing admissible evidence, and once that is recognized, Esage's blank field labeled reality is not actually blank. A metaphysical filter has already been placed across it, fulfilling the diagram. This is where pramāṇa does something more interesting than merely criticizing Esage's model. It completes it. Her diagram effectively contains two primary movements into the unknown: pratyoksha, encounter something not previously observed, anumāna, infer something not previously understood. We can add a third, shabda, receive information that the unaided observer could not independently obtain. Suddenly, the epistemic frontier is no longer merely a coastline progressively conquered by explorers. There may also be transmission from the other side of the boundary. This is a profound modification of the picture. Esage's model imagines knowledge principally as an outward human movement: knower right arrow, unknown right arrow, discovery right arrow, formalization right arrow, civilization. Pramāṇa permits a second vector: reality right arrow, disclosure right arrow, reception right arrow, understanding right arrow, verification. The first is discovery, the second is revelation. Neither word by itself guarantees truth. Bad observation exists, bad inference exists, false testimony exists. The task of epistemology is therefore not to sanctify one category and ridicule the others. The task is to establish the conditions under which each becomes valid. That is exactly what pramāṇa theory attempts to do. AI looks different from here. This modification also improves Esage's AI argument. Her strongest insight may not actually be that AI cannot generate novelty. It may be that intelligence and epistemic authority are not the same thing. An AI can compare thousands of manuscripts. It can identify contradictions, it can construct syllogisms, it can summarize commentaries, it can perform textual analysis, it can suggest interpretations. It may eventually outperform almost every human being at many such intellectual operations. None of that automatically makes it an independent pramāṇa, and this distinction matters enormously. An AI system can process a measurement without becoming the physical phenomenon measured. It can process testimony without becoming the source of that testimony. It can manipulate a revelation tradition without thereby acquiring revelatory authority. Within strict Vaishnava Siddhanta, therefore, AI could become an extraordinarily capable instrument of pratyoksha and anumāna, and an extraordinarily capable processor of textual shabda, while remaining derivative with respect to the epistemic source itself. That is a much more durable distinction than humans invent, machines recombine. The latter may someday prove technologically false. The former concerns the provenance of knowledge rather than the computational sophistication of its processor, the objective function problem. Esage also senses another important boundary when she asks where objectives come from. AI systems can optimize. They can increasingly construct subgoals, revise plans, and select strategies. But the deeper question is not whether a machine can formulate a local objective. It is, what makes an objective worth pursuing? Here scientific materialism confronts an old philosophical difficulty. Science can tell us remarkably well what happens if we do X. It does not follow that science alone can tell us whether X ought to be done. Optimization requires a criterion. Acceleration requires a direction, power requires an end. This exposes another weakness in Esage's otherwise useful conclusion that AI is neutral. She explicitly notes that ethics has been excluded from her model, and then infers from the model that she sees no intrinsically destructive result. But a model that has excluded ethical variables cannot establish ethical neutrality. It can establish only that ethical valence is outside the model. If I construct a model of nuclear fission containing only energy output, the fact that the equations contain no moral variable does not demonstrate that Hiroshima and a civilian nuclear reactor are morally interchangeable. Likewise, acceleration is not synonymous with progress. It is simply increased rate of change. Whether accelerated intelligence produces flourishing or catastrophe depends partly upon ends. And here Vedic epistemology again expands the problem rather than merely opposing modern technology. Bhagavad Gita explicitly presents Shastra as pramāṇa in questions concerning what ought and ought not to be done. That is a category of knowledge largely absent from Esage's diagram. She has modeled, what can we know, how does knowledge propagate, how can knowledge create economic value. She has not yet adequately modeled, what is knowledge for, that may ultimately be the biggest missing region. Science and Shabda need not be competitors. None of this requires diminishing science. Indeed, doing so would weaken the argument. If I want to know whether a bridge can bear a particular load, scripture is not the relevant instrument. If I want to sequence a genome, I need molecular biology. If I want to characterize a vulnerability in a network protocol, I need observation, experimentation, formal reasoning, and technical expertise. Pratyoksha and Anumana are not defective because they have domains. Every epistemic method has a domain. The mistake occurs when excellence within one domain becomes a metaphysical claim to universality. A microscope does not become foolish because it cannot see justice. It becomes misused if someone insists that justice cannot exist because it cannot be placed beneath the microscope. The Vedic proposition is therefore not, replace science with scripture. A much more interesting formulation is, do not demand that one pramāṇa perform the work of another. Use perception where perception is competent. Use inference where inference is warranted. Use authoritative testimony where the proposed object of knowledge is inaccessible to ordinary perception and inference, and then subject that testimony to the rigorous criteria governing its authenticity, transmission, and interpretation. That is a far more sophisticated position than faith versus reason. The rigor Alisa may not have encountered. And here we can return sympathetically to the sentence from which this entire discussion began. When Esage says that religion is insufficiently rigorous to serve as a foundation for her model, I do not hear arrogance. I hear a perfectly understandable conclusion from the religious options that modern intellectual culture typically places before a technically trained person. If religion means accepting unverifiable assertions because they are comforting, if it means charismatic personalities improvising theology, if it means private revelation that cannot be challenged, if it means interpreting scripture however one pleases, if it means insulating claims from reason, then her objection is entirely justified. That would not be rigorous enough, but that is precisely why the pramāṇa tradition is so interesting. Classical Vaishnava epistemology asks, what is the source? What qualifies the source? How is the information transmitted? Has the transmission been altered? Is the teacher authorized by the preceding tradition? Is the interpretation consistent with Shastra? Does it agree with prior realized teachers? Are we importing meanings demanded by our own preferred conclusion? Are the observer's faculties reliable for the object being investigated? Is the observer himself compromised by error, distraction, motive, or deception? Can the proposed knowledge be realized through the discipline it prescribes? What is hypothesis? What is inference? What is perception? What is revelation? And where does each possess legitimate jurisdiction? That is not the abandonment of rigor. It is an extraordinary attempt to extend rigor beyond the boundary of empiricism. There is even a sense in which its demands are more severe than those normally placed upon scientific communication, not because Vedanta is better physics, which would be an absurd comparison, but because the transmitter is not permitted merely to reproduce useful results. He must preserve the epistemic provenance of the message. The observer must be examined along with the observation. The motive of the knower matters. The state of the instrument includes the state of the mind, and the transmission must survive generations without becoming the private intellectual property of the transmitter. That is a formidable standard, the beautiful thing about an unfinished model. At the end of her lecture, Esage does something that makes this response possible in the first place. She tells her audience that the free money zone model is recent, rough, and probably contains inconsistencies. That admission should be taken seriously. She is not presenting a catechism. She is thinking in public, and that is why the lecture deserves to be heard. Its value does not depend upon every line of the diagram being correct. the model performs a much rarer service. It allows us to see where questions connect: knowledge, novelty, economic value, AI, human agency, the limits of perception, the boundary between model and reality, the origin of objectives, and ultimately the question underlying all the others. How does a finite knower obtain reliable knowledge about a reality larger than the knower? Esage gets remarkably close to the ancient pramāṇa problem without naming it. She correctly recognizes that our representation of reality is not reality. She correctly recognizes that perception is mediated. She correctly recognizes that scientific rigor does not confer infallibility. She correctly recognizes that inference and pattern recognition can generate enormous power without necessarily constituting completely new knowledge. She correctly recognizes that intelligence may transform the boundary between what is known and what can be operationalized. Her model, therefore, does not need to be discarded. It needs one more dimension. The unknown is not necessarily mute. Reality need not be imagined solely as passive territory waiting for increasingly powerful intelligences to colonize it. If reality contains consciousness prior to ours, if intelligence is fundamental rather than merely an accidental late product of matter, then the ultimate epistemological possibility is not simply that we may discover reality. It is that reality may disclose itself to us. At that point, the question ceases to be whether religion is rigorous. The serious question becomes, what would a rigorous science of receiving such disclosure have to look like? And at precisely that point, a conversation with Vedic pramāṇa does not end Alisa Esage's inquiry. It simply takes flight. The rigor she rightly demands becomes not a fence around the known, but the very discipline by which thought may rise beyond its borders and enter that undefined expanse she calls reality.